1,000 acres in our geographic area. I hope most of you have been out to one of our many preserves to enjoy what we offer to the public. I'm partial to Hidden Valley Nature Center, where we have a lot of vernal pools and where there's many trails to be enjoyed year-round and huts to rent, and all sorts of educational programs which happen around the region, not just at Hidden Valley Nature Center. And I'll just mention that the vernal pools at Hidden Valley Nature Center, which is located in Jefferson, are distributed throughout the 1,000-acre preserve that's there. But there's one that's right near the gate, just as you enter, which is a wonderful place to go and check out the eggs and the wildlife that's there. It's very accessible. So with that, I'll introduce Amanda, and she has done programs for us now for, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 years, and we love having her. Dr. Amanda Shearin Cross. She's from Maine, Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and I don't know much else about her background, but I do know that she's very entertaining and informative. So I'll hand it over to you, Amanda. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, you bet. I'll try to turn on my video. There we go. Okay.
Let me just say one more thing. If you, I'm going to be sort of monitoring questions, and for the most part, we'll try and save them to the end, and I'll try and consolidate them. But just put something in a chat for those of you in the audience, and we'll get to them at the end. Thanks. Go ahead, Amanda. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for the introduction. It's great to be here with you all. I know it is a beautiful evening. You have, I suspect, other things to attend to, dinners and walks and hikes and everything else. And so I really appreciate you sharing some time with me tonight, talking about my favorite ecosystem in the world. I have about 45 minutes of material, mostly pictures, not a ton of really in-depth science stuff, but we'll move through it quickly, and we'll have time for questions at the end. I'm certainly not offended if folks need to go early to, like I said, to attend to other things, kids, dinner, whatnot, dogs. I'm happy to have you for the time that you're here. And it's, Bambi, thank you for the nice introduction. I've been studying vernal pools now in Maine for, I guess this marks my 15th year. Certainly was interested in them long before then, but had the opportunity to do my PhD work with the great Dr. Aram Calhoun at the University of Maine. She's sort of known as, I would call her the mother of vernal pools, certainly in the Northeast, if not the world. So much of what I know, I learned from her and her expertise and guidance. And if you ever have a chance to interact with her and work with her, I recommend it. She's fantastic. Like Bambi said, I work for the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. I coordinate our Beginning with Habitat program, which is a statewide program to assist landowners, communities, land trusts with conservation planning, to make folks aware of where different resources are on the landscape and how best to conserve them. I also coordinate our climate change efforts and our wildlife action plan. So without further ado, I'll dive into this. Let me know if at any time something happens on the technology end. I am dealing with a broken mouse, and so I am fumbling my way through screens using my touchpad, which is not something I typically do. So let me know, flag, do a emoticon or something in the box, or put something in the chat. Let Allie or Bambi know, and I'll try to fix it. It looks like I'm not sharing my screen. Is that correct?
I see your screen.
You do see my screen?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yep, I see your screen.
Oh, here we go. See, it's happening already. It's already telling me yeah. Okay, well, if you guys can see it, great. Let me know if at any point you can't. Let's try to get it to advance. Okay, can you see to the slide change?
Yes.
It did.
Yes.
Great. Okay. All right. It sounds like we're good to go. I'm going to turn my camera off temporarily just to save some bandwidth, but I'll turn it back on once we have questions and answers. So, it's interesting joining Mid-Coast Conservancy again this year. This marks a year since the last time I gave this presentation. And this presentation was my first remote presentation during COVID. And it was such a kind of monumental moment, not expecting that we'd still be here a year later, kind of in this format, except that, as Bambi mentioned, we have some opportunities now to be outside and do other walks and see vernal pools, I think, in a way that we couldn't last year or weren't comfortable maybe doing last year. So it's a pleasure to be here again, even in this format remotely, because it's a chance to interact perhaps with more of you than we would have if we were in person. But typically, I think we typically gather at a vernal pool and talk and look at stuff. And this is the format, I would have presented in the past. But this works pretty well too, because the great thing about vernal pools is that they're easily accessible for most of us to go and take the information we talk about tonight and see on our own. See, here we go with my mouse not cooperating. Oh. Okay, there we go. Got it to go. So tonight, this is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about what is a vernal pool. Seems like a basic question, but like most things in science, when you get into it, it gets a lot more complicated. We're going to meet some of the creatures that live there. We're going to talk about the larger role of vernal pools in the ecosystem. And then we're going to talk about what do you need to know for visiting a vernal pool. Pretty basic stuff, but just a couple safety and best practices so that you can keep your family safe and keep the pool safe. All right, I am going to try to do a poll here because I'd like to hear what you all have to think about a couple thoughts. Okay, so I'm going to share with you a poll from a website called Mentimeter. And let me know, hopefully you guys can see that in front of you. It should say, what is your favorite sign of spring? And what you can do is go to this website here, menti.com. And then when you go to that website, you'll see a box that says to enter this code. Enter that code, and you can select which of these is your favorite sign of spring. You can actually pick more than one if you're really excited about any one of these. And I'll give you guys a minute to fill it out. And send me a chat in the chat box if you, for some reason, can't access it. All right, we're getting some results. We've got a tie, though. We need, we need some more votes. Oh, wait another couple seconds. All right, a couple more. Flowers blooming, birds, longer days. Yes, all of these things, right, are amazing marks of the transformative time of year we're in right now. And for me, all of these are related, including the ticks, unfortunately, which we'll talk about safety-wise here at the end. But vernal pools for me are a very big part of what I look forward to and what I expect in the spring. And so as cool as they are as an ecosystem, if I'm thinking about my year and what I'm looking forward to me, they're how I mark time. They're how I think about and welcome back this new, season of spring that we're in now. So thank you guys for trying that poll out. All right, I'm going to take us back. I'll turn my camera on here for a second. I'll take us back to our presentation. I'll try to, at least. Okay, hopefully you guys should see my presentation slide again. Okay, so great, thanks, Allie. So what is a vernal pool? Basic question. If you asked a group of third graders, you probably get some answers about frogs and puddles and rain and things like that. And I think sometimes because vernal pools, they're like people, they're unique. No two are alike. And so if we're thinking about what they are, sometimes I find the easiest way to start is to talk about what they are not. So for example, they are not retention ditches or irrigation ponds. They are not beaver flowages or streams that have been blocked by beaver activity. They are not roadside ditches. Even though the animals we're going to meet in a few minutes breed in these areas themselves are not vernal pools. Lakes are not vernal pools. You probably knew that one. So when we're thinking about what they are, I tend to organize my thinking into 5 key characteristics that define a vernal pool and sets them as a class, as a wetland type apart from other types of wetlands. The first, and we'll talk about these, the first is the most important, the temporary hydro period. That's the amount of time that there's water in the pool. They're typically small, they're typically forested, or actually they have to be forested. We'll talk about why in a second. They need to be fishless, and they need to provide breeding habitat for particular amphibians and invertebrates that we'll meet here in a second. So here's the characteristics of vernal pools that sets them apart from any other type of ecosystem. Okay, so here's the first one, the temporary hydro period. Basically what that means is that the water that is in a vernal pool is only there temporarily. It's not there permanently like you would see in a lake or a river or another type of permanent aquatic feature. So why, how can you sort of think about that on the landscape? What might that look like? So this time of year, this is one of my favorite vernal pools in all of Maine. This was taken down east in Hancock County, right before you get to the Washington County line. And I call it the Emerald Pool because it's bright green. It's the most gorgeous pool I've ever seen. This time of year, when this photo was taken, it was actually a couple weeks from now. So later in May, you can see the leaves are fleshed out there on the trees. The center of this pool was over my head. So I'm 5'6", so that tells you, at least how deep it was. That's May. Take a look at where that tree is. Come August, so May, June, July, August, so only 3 months later, that pool that was probably 6 feet deep at its deepest is now dry. There is no water except for a very, very tiny square foot section in the center. There is no water in this pool. That is a temporary hydro period. The water is only there for part of the time. Now, sometimes pools will dry maybe every other year, maybe every 3 years, but they have to dry down at some point. That's one of the major characteristics of a vernal pool. Okay, so they tend to be small. Now, this is a really, really tiny vernal pool. In Maine, our vernal pools tend to be less than an acre. They're not huge, huge features on the landscape. And that's why oftentimes they get missed. Oftentimes they get missed on aerial photography, on things like National Wetland Inventory maps. They're hard to see using remote sensing methods. And so oftentimes you're not even going to know you have one in your backyard until you're walking there, listening for frogs, looking for things. So they tend to be, I think of them as little surprises on the landscape sometimes as you're walking around, and all of a sudden, boom, there's a vernal pool. So another characteristic is they have to be forested. I referred to them earlier as a wetland ecosystem, but that's kind of wrong in a way, in that really what they are, they're forested ecosystems, because everything about a vernal pool is driven by the forest. Because that water dries down, much of the nutrients that are going into a vernal pool are coming from the surrounding forest. So the leaves that fall into the pool, the sticks, the logs, all those sources of nutrients are going into the pool and are driving all of the nutrient processes that are happening there. They're also providing refugia, or places for animals to hide that are living in the vernal pool. Forests are also, as you can imagine, in the summertime, providing shade and, like I said, providing attachment sites, nutrients, etc. The other thing that's really important about forests is that during the summer, when a forest is growing and its leaves are growing and the trees are getting bigger and they're sucking up water from the pool, they're actually helping to dry down the pool perhaps faster than it would on its own if it didn't have the trees surrounding it. So that's kind of the impact on the pool itself, that direct impact on the pool. But more importantly, as we see some of the animals that live in vernal pools, the forest provides the habitat. It provides the landscape, the homes for everything that's in the vernal pool. When we talk about vernal pool organisms, which we'll meet here in a minute, they're really forest organisms because they're only in the vernal pool for a short period of time, a small percentage of their lives. The rest of their lives, they're actually in the forest. And so if they didn't have the forest, they wouldn't survive. The pool is there for their breeding, but everything else around them is what's essential for their survival. Okay, fourth characteristic, they need to be fishless. Why is that? The critters that live in vernal pools, that breed in vernal pools, don't have the same fish defense characteristics that other animals do that live with fish. So bullfrogs, for example, their tadpoles are toxic to fish. They don't taste good. Same thing with green frogs. That's why you can paddle around a pond in Maine and hear a bullfrog calling. They're everywhere. That's because they themselves and their tadpoles don't taste good to fish. They don't get eaten by fish. Here's an example of an experiment I did way back in time in graduate school, looking at what small fish could do to, this is a spotted salamander egg mass, or several of them. And basically what we found is that even small fish like golden shiners, you can see circled here, these little fish here underneath, even small fish, if they can get into an egg mass, they will start eating eggs of salamanders. So these salamanders don't have defenses against fish. They would all get eaten up and not be able to coexist very easily with fish. That being said, we do have occurrences of salamanders that are able to exist with fish because they can hide from them. But in general, the animals that live in vernal pools would not do well if they were constantly exposed to fish eating them. The other thing about being fishless that ties into this hydroperiod we talked about is the hydroperiod, because it's only there, the water is not there permanently. If there were fish that got into a vernal pool, they would die because that pool would dry down eventually. The other thing, though, that is important to keep in mind is with that short hydroperiod kills other stuff that would love to eat vernal pool organisms. And one of those big predators is other frogs. So you'll see here, if you can identify this green frog snack, can you see what's in his mouth there? So what happens is in a vernal pool that's not drying down, let's say you have a pool that you tried to create and you dug it really deep and it's not drying out. And for whatever reason, it's keeping water in it year after year after year after year. What happens is things like green frogs move in and bullfrogs move in, and their tadpoles need a couple years to develop. So they're only going to survive in places that have water year round for multiple years. And so what happens is that not only would you have to worry about fish if you're something like a wood frog or a spotted salamander that's living in a vernal pool, but you'd also have to start to worry about other types of frogs that need water year round to be able to live. So having that short hydroperiod prevents fish from living in a vernal pool, so it makes them fishless, but it also prevents other types of predators from living there as well. And right here is another picture from that experiment I showed earlier, looking at these are little green frog tadpoles. Well, they're not so little. They're kind of medium green frog tadpoles that were also eating these little tiny salamander babies that are inside of this egg mass. Okay, this is where we'll talk a little bit more about the animals that live in vernal pools. So in Maine, vernal pools are important breeding habitat. They are the primary breeding habitat for 4 species in Maine: fairy shrimp, wood frogs, spotted salamanders, and blue spotted salamanders. So I'm going kind of left to right there. I'll talk about each in a little more detail here in a second. But here, that's sort of the big 4 that you would look for here in Maine. Other parts of the Northeast, there would be other things to look for, things like marbled salamanders. But here in Maine, these are the 4 that you want to keep in mind. These are also the 4 that if you're looking at vernal pools in a regulatory context, So for example, a state significant vernal pool, these are the primary animals you're going to be looking for. Okay, so our first species that would breed in a vernal pool is called fairy shrimp. I say it's a species. It's actually, we have a couple species in the Northeast that we know of. There are at least 2 species of fairy shrimp that occur in the Northeast. The first species, the vernal fairy shrimp, occurs more in southern New England. And then as you move north, sort of where we are, we start to see more of something that's called the knob-lipped fairy shrimp, which I think is a fantastic name. Those are the ones that are more of this reddish color that look more like shrimp. And their characteristic that's so interesting to observe is that they swim on their back with these kind of feathery appendages up above them. These are the males that you would be seeing swimming around like that. And they're actually fairly big. When they first hatch out, they are fairly small and grow very quickly through 11 different stages until they reach this size of about 1.5 inches. So by the time they're grown into adults in the span of about 2 weeks or so, they're pretty big and you can see them with the naked eye. But what is so interesting about these guys, and if you ever had sea monkeys as kids, is that you can't predict necessarily when or where you're going to find them. So they, like the other organisms we'll talk about, would be a lovely fish snack. If a fish was in a vernal pool with these guys, that fish would have a field day. So very, very, very good prey item for fish. So what they do is they hatch out very, very early in spring. They occur in these little cysts that are resistant to drought. And in fact, we find that you have a better hatching rate if they dry down. So basically on the floor of a pool, you might have anywhere from, estimates are up to 1,000 of these little tiny cysts all over the floor of that vernal pool, 1,000 of them per square foot. And only about 3% of them are going to hatch every single year. And so they hatch quickly. They're usually the earliest things you might see in a pool. Sometimes there's still ice on a pool and you'll see them swimming underneath the ice. They grow very quickly, like I said, over 1 to 2 weeks. They mate, they lay their eggs, the females lay cysts again, and then they're gone, they're dead. The adults are dead. So super, super quick compressed life cycle. And they're basically racing, like everything we're going to talk about here, they're racing against that hydro period. They're racing against time. They're racing against dry down. Keep in mind that image I showed you of the vernal pool with the 6 feet of water in it in May. That's, these guys are already going and breeding and laying eggs by that point, because by August, there's no water. They have to do what they need to do very, very quickly and complete their life cycle. So these fairy shrimp are, like I said, if you find them in Maine, it's quite a gift. Of all the pools I've studied in Maine, I can count only a handful that I've been able to find fairy shrimp in repeatedly. They tend to be in higher water quality pools. So often we don't find them along roadsides or in highly disturbed pools. They tend to be in kind of intact forested ecosystems, floodplains, things like that. But there's certainly a lot of efforts going on right now to learn more about them. So keep your eyes out for them. Okay, this species here, I bet many of us have heard this over the last couple weeks. This is the one that always reminds me, spring is here again. So one of my favorite species here, the wood frog, characterized by this brownish colored mask here, triangular mask behind the eye, and this cream or white colored lip band here. Okay, so here's your turn. If we were all together, we'd be practicing the sounds. Or if I had my kids here next to me, I might have them do it. But here's a question, what sound do I make? If it quacks like a duck, it might actually be me. I know it's corny, but this is what this is for me the easiest way to remember what these guys sound like, is that they're trickster ducks. So if you hear a quacking sound in early spring in a forested area that doesn't have a pond, chances are it's not ducks, it's these wood frogs. And I can't give a vernal pool presentation without attempting to do my wood frog call, so bear with me. But this is what they sound like. I have no idea how that sounds over Zoom, but you guys have probably heard that. It's a lot of fun to do with your kids to make that sound and to talk back to them. But even before we hear spring peepers we always think of as a sentinel of spring. Wood frogs have already started calling before you hear the spring peepers. They're the first amphibians you hear calling in Maine. You can see this guy here. I say guy because it's a male. And if you notice how skinny he is around his abdomen, when these guys first emerge in spring, and it's the guys who are waking up first, the males who are waking up first, they are headed to the vernal pools. And again, like the fairy shrimp, they're racing against time. And so they are not eating, they're not stopping to feed, they're not stopping to collect their $200. They're going right to the vernal pool to breed as quickly as possible and then to get out of there. So this time of year, or a couple weeks ago, I suppose at this point, as wood frogs were moving around on the landscape, if you catch any, you'll see they're very, very skinny. The males are. Females are a different story. So one way to tell this time of year, it can be very easy to tell apart males and females. One, because of the size difference, the females are often larger. They will often appear with expanded abdomens, meaning that they're gravid, so they have eggs inside of them that are developing and ready to be laid. They also have this really beautiful brick reddish coloration. The males tend to be more of a tan or a brown, and they'll actually change colors throughout the season and can appear in different colors as well across the color spectrum. So you can have ones that are very, very brown, very gray, kind of tan, kind of all over the board. But what you want to look for is that characteristic triangular black mask and that white lip line. So this is the male, this is the female, and they are breeding. They're in a pose called amplexus. Okay, so when I talked about vernal pools being wetlands and that kind of being a lie, that in fact they're really forested ecosystems, this is why. Because the vernal pool is so much more than the pool itself. It really is the surrounding landscape when we think about the animals that live in pools and how they use them. So here's a pool. Let's take our pretend pool. Here's our upland habitat, forested, mixed forest, and here's a forested wetland. So wood frogs start arriving at pools in Maine between March and April. They breed very quickly. They're called explosive breeders. They all breed at once within a span of a week or so, and then they're out of there. Then they go back to the forest. So they're only there for 2% of their life, the adults, very short amount of time. Their eggs, which we'll look at in a second, but they look like large clusters of black dots and this kind of bubbly sort of matrix. The eggs hatch out in about 2 weeks. It takes about 2 to 3 months for their tadpoles to develop. And remember, keep in mind that vernal pool I showed you earlier, it's drying down the whole time. They have to complete this life cycle very quickly. They have to get from breeding adults to little tiny frogs that can hop out of the pool in the span of 3 months. So it's all going quickly. Okay, so tadpoles develop 2 to 3 months. And then around July or August, that pool is drying down. Those tadpoles are getting the cue that there's less oxygen in that pool. They need to start metamorphosing or turning into frogs, essentially, or metamorphs as we call them. And so around July or August, they look like these little tiny froglets, and they start leaving the pool and often will head into forested wetlands to summer and to feed and to spend their overwintering time. Then they'll head, as they get older, they'll head back up into the upland, overwinter, spend time in the upland as well, and sort of move around this whole landscape that they have available to them. They're only using that vernal pool when they're mating as adults and when they're developing as eggs and as tadpoles. After that, they're heading to all these other places on the landscape. And they'll live for about 2 to 5 years. Close-up of an egg mass, like I said, each of these black dots is an egg. And this kind of, I think it looks like a brain, like these little convolutions all over it. Those are the protective membranes around the eggs themselves. So you can see kind of in this clump here, there's anywhere, just to estimate, probably, 200 eggs or so. And like I said, they're explosive breeders. They breed all at once and they breed all together, and they lay their eggs together in something called a communal mass. Typically, sometimes you'll see them individually. You see them all the time individually. But if there's a big group of them, they tend to lay their eggs all together. And the reason is that laying your eggs all together like this, they're creating a darker mass that's going to absorb more sunlight, absorb more heat, and be able to kick that hatching process off sooner than if they weren't all together, more dispersed throughout the vernal pool. Again, they're racing against time. They're going to choose strategies that make their offspring develop faster so that they can hatch faster, grow up faster, and get out of that pool before it dries down. This also allows them to escape other types of predators that are in vernal pools. So we're not talking about fish or green frog tadpoles, but there's a bunch of other stuff that lives in vernal pools that loves to eat egg masses of amphibians. So things like caddisflies, things like dragonfly larvae. Those are all predators that are found in vernal pool systems. And so an egg or an egg mass is super vulnerable because it's not moving. It can't hide. It can't swim away from anything that's trying to eat it. So the idea is for these guys to hatch out quickly so that they can run away or swim away if they need to from a predator. You can often see these egg masses stacked like 3, 4, 5 deep in the water column. So if you're ever trying to count how many egg masses you have in a pool, don't just look at what you have on the surface. Gently look at what you have underneath the surface as well. Okay, indicator species number 3. So we had fairy shrimp, we had wood frogs. Now we're on the third of the 4 species. This is the one I'm going to spend some time on because it's my favorite. It's the one I spent most of my time studying. This is the spotted salamander. And I would pit this species against any other charismatic megafauna, from bears to whales, because I think these guys have the coolest features and make the most interesting movements and lifespans that for something this small is just astounding. And I'll talk to you more about that in a second. Okay, so we saw this graphic before for wood frogs, but we'll talk about it here for spotted salamanders. So these guys, again, they're vernal pool organisms, but they're really forested organisms. They're spending most of their time in the forest. And so these guys will move down to a vernal pool about the same time as wood frogs, but a little bit later. Usually it's the males that start arriving at the breeding areas first, and they'll start laying these little packets of sperm called spermatophores. We have some photos of those in a second. But often the males, and it's usually younger males that will start arriving first, will start laying these sperm packets, and then the females will come along sometime later. You might have heard of something called big night or nuptial dances. And that's where you have this big congress of spotted salamanders all arriving at a vernal pool all at once. And they do these very kind of majestic, intricate dances with one another that help stimulate breeding. So that can all occur sort of over the span of, one night or a couple nights. But these guys will actually drag out their mating period kind of over a few weeks. So you'll see some start to arrive on vernal pools in April. Then they'll, lay their spermatophores, mate, and then they're gone. Then you'll start to see others coming, and it's kind of a more trickle breeding system over a few weeks rather than all at once like wood frogs. Their eggs take sometimes a couple months or up to a month or so to hatch, and then from that point into the development of their larvae. This is a little tiny larvae or a baby salamander there living in a vernal pool. That takes a little bit longer than for wood frogs. These guys take about 2 to 4 months to completely develop in the vernal pool. And they have some, we'll talk about it in a second, they have some features that kind of make them a little bit more adapted to hanging out in a system that has more predators than something like wood frogs. Then they start leaving the vernal pool later generally than wood frogs, so late July through September, and they emerge again like wood frogs as these little tiny miniature versions of grown-ups. You can see here the scale bar on my ruler there. You know, this little guy here was, oh gosh, you know, maybe 1.5 inches, something like that, 2 inches long. So little tiny miniature salamander. And again, like with the wood frog, moving up into the upland forested habitats. These guys are called mole salamanders because they live in places that have been created by things like voles and moles. And they themselves cannot dig holes. They have to rely on holes created by other species. So by, you know, moles, like I said, and voles, but also tree roots and things like that. And in the summertime, when they're hanging out in their upland habitats, they'll actually hang out at the entrance of a burrow and wait for prey to pass by. The amazing thing about these guys, I think, is that they can live a very long time. They can live up to 20 years in the wild, not even in captivity, but in the wild. And some of the work that was done here in Maine, where we actually could take a section of toe and cut that toe section, the bone, very, very, very thinly, stain it and put it underneath a microscope and actually count the growth rings like you would with a tree or with fish scales. And you can actually age salamanders to get an idea of how long they've been around. The toes do grow back. It's an approved method for aging salamanders, but it's amazing to think how long these guys can live. 20 years is something that's, you know, 8 inches long or so, making these big migrations through the forest. Birds would love to eat them. Owls would, you know, everything out there would love to eat them, raccoons, but able to escape all those predators, move back and forth for 20 years to me continues to astound me. Like I said, about 8 inches long. And this time of year, again, like with wood frogs, it's fairly easy to tell apart the males and females. The females, just like the wood frogs, tend to have this bloated appearance. They're gravid, so they have eggs within them right now that once they take up those spermatophores from a male, they'll get ready to lay those eggs. Their spots often tend to be more muted, so not as brightly colored. The males during mating season, so this time of year, will be really, really bright yellow, have these bright yellow spots all over them. And they tend to be smaller as well. Here's an example of a gravid female. You can see I've got my scale bar there. You know, she's probably, gosh, I don't know, close to 20 centimeters long and just full of eggs ready to lay. Their egg masses are quite different than wood frogs. And the reason we spend so much time on egg masses when we're talking about vernal pools is that they're usually the things that you see. It's very hard to see wood frogs unless you catch them on the nights that they're moving to the pool or they're breeding in the pool. It's hard to see spotted salamanders. They're very cryptic. They live most of their lives underground, except when they're breeding. But they leave behind their egg masses. And that's how we can usually most easily see if they're there in a pool and be able to count them. So the thing about salamander egg masses is that where a wood frog looks like a brain, salamander egg masses have this extra membrane around them. I've drawn it with this orange line, and it's basically an extra case that keeps the individual eggs, here are the eggs, these golden colored embryos with an egg sac around it. It keeps them protected, and it keeps them, because it takes these eggs a longer time to hatch out. It can take them, you know, up to a month, whereas the wood frog's only taking maybe a week. They can't move. They're being exposed to more predators. So having this thick envelope around them allows them to resist more of that predation. And it also allows them to exist in places that, you know, might dry down a little bit more. If an egg mass, let's say, is laid on the top of a pool, when there's water in that pool, and then all of a sudden that pool starts drying out a little bit more, that egg mass is going to be high and dry above the water surface until it rains again. This protective barrier around the egg mass allows those embryos to live for a few days out of water, in the hopes that it will rain again and they'll again be submerged. So spotted salamander basses, you can find them in clear or in cloudy. There's nothing wrong with these. It's just like people, we look different, and so do salamander egg masses. It just depends genetically on the female. The female that lays a cloudy egg mass has a different type of protein than those that are laying or ejects a different kind of protein into the egg mass than those that are laying these clear ones. So this is perfectly natural. It's just showing kind of genetic diversity of the salamanders you have in an area. And you can see here, there's actually two. There's this one that's white, and then there's another one here that's next to it. Okay, so like I said, you can have clear or cloudy spotted salamander egg masses, but you can also have green. And the green ones aren't sick, they're not dying, they're actually benefiting from a symbiotic algae called Oophilia ambystamatis, which I love the translation in Latin, from Latin, means salamander egg lover. It's a symbiotic algae that lives in the egg mass, and it actually lives in the female's reproductive tract, so that when she lays her egg mass, that algae gets deposited along with the eggs, and basically grows over time, feeding on the wastes from the little tiny developing embryos, feeding on the phosphorus and the nitrogen. And in exchange, that algae is creating oxygen for the embryos that are growing within that egg mass. Remember I showed you guys that envelope that goes around the egg mass? That envelope is great for keeping that egg mass from drying out, but that also means that less air gets into the egg mass, into those embryos growing in the middle. And so this algae actually helps feed those embryos in the inside of the egg mass with oxygen that they wouldn't get otherwise. I talked about the males arriving at vernal pools first and laying spermatophores, those sperm packets. This is what they look like. They look like little conical shaped blobs with a white kind of tip. And if you look at this from afar, and hopefully you can still see them this time of year, they're still out there, is it just looks like flecks of lichen on the bottom of a vernal pool. And sometimes it does trick you. Sometimes it is indeed lichen or little bits of leaves. But if you look closer and you look around and look at it closer with your eye, and you start seeing these conical shapes, that's your indication that indeed there are spotted salamanders here, even if you're not starting to see the egg masses. I always think of these spermatophores as like an early warning system. When I start seeing those, that's telling me the males are starting to arrive, and the females will not be long behind, and I'll likely start seeing egg masses pretty soon. This is what they look like. You can see it just, if you weren't looking for them, you'd probably miss them because it's not terribly distinct. Looks like I said, little flecks of lichen, but these are actually little individual sperm packets there on the bottom of the vernal pool. Okay, I'm going to do this one very quickly. One, in the interest of time, and two, because they have a wicked complex genetic history that I am not comfortable explaining because it is more complicated than I have my head wrapped around. That being said, at the end of this, I have links to some really great resources that help explain this in good detail and can provide kind of the overview of the complicated genetic history of this. But in Maine, our fourth species that we can find in vernal pools is actually kind of a complex of a bunch of different species called the blue spotted salamander complex. They're very similar in life history to spotted salamanders. They interbreed with a species that is not here in Maine called the Jefferson salamander. And over time, it's created this hybrid that we see most of here in Maine. And what's interesting about these hybrids, again, 95+% of the blue spotted salamanders in Maine that we have here are this hybrid that's produced from a blue spotted salamander long ago interbreeding with a Jefferson salamander. And what's interesting is that these salamanders perpetuate themselves unisexually, and that most of their offspring are females. They need the presence of sperm to stimulate that egg growth and development, but they don't actually take up that sperm and create a diploid or a new offspring from that. So it's fascinating I wish I had time to go into it, but I'm just putting it out there that if you see one of these, it's a kind of a unique sighting. They're not as common as wood frogs and as spotted salamanders, and they have this really interesting genetic history behind them. Their masses also look quite different in that they look like, I think of the movie Ghostbusters and Slimer sliming up the library, and there's just like all this green slime dripping off of everything. That's how I think of blue spotted salamander egg masses to look like. They're just kind of drippy and not as intact as a spotted salamander. The egg masses look quite different between a pure blue spotted salamander, so not the hybrid, the ones that are breeding males and females. They look, very small, sometimes laid singly. The hybrids don't produce for their eggs. They're not producing a lot of viable eggs, so you often will see these cloudy masses. It's not cloudy like the spotted salamander. Those cloudy masses are very much a part of their, genetic diversity. But for these guys, when you see this, it's eggs that are not viable. Okay, so I'm going to put these all together and then kind of wrap it up with some big picture stuff. So we've got our pool. They tend to be small. We talked about that. They need to be forested to provide nutrients and cover and temperature regulation, but most importantly, habitat for the species that live there. They cannot have fish in them. Otherwise, everything in them gets gobbled up. And they provide habitat for some important species that live here in Maine. Where are they found? So they're found all over the state. They're quite dense in southern and central Maine, but you can find them at the tip of the state and far western Maine as well. They can be found in isolated depressions in the middle of a forest. Those are those surprise ones that if you come across them and you think, oh my gosh, what is this? Wow, look at this whole world of life in the middle of the forest. But they can also be found as depressions in bigger wetlands. So you might have a big shrub wetland or a big forested wetland, and you have a depression within that supports more water throughout the growing season, and you have a vernal pool created there. There's some really interesting vernal pools that are created in floodplains. So when a river or a stream overtops its banks and then withdraws, if there's a depression in that floodplain, sometimes it can hold water long enough to support vernal pool breeding organisms. And this is often, or not often, but we've certainly found fairy shrimp breeding in these types of floodplain depression vernal pools. So this is where I want to think, we spend a lot of time thinking about the pool itself, the egg masses, the animals, the things that are in the pool, but it's so much more than just what's in the water and what's in that vernal pool depression. I tried to illustrate that a bit with showing the forested landscape and within which these pools exist. But I want to kind of bring our brains a little more broadly and thinking about what role these things play in the greater landscape. So beyond the 4 different groups of species we talked about before, vernal pools are also home and habitat for many, many other species in the state. So of the 17 amphibian species we have in Maine, 11 of them use vernal pools at some point in their life for breeding, feeding, etc. That's a pretty big percentage of our amphibians in Maine. 9 of our 17 reptile species also use vernal pools, again, for feeding and foraging and summering. As far as the species in our state that are at risk, so those that are listed as state endangered, threatened, special concern, there are 10 species associated with vernal pools that fall under one of those at-risk categories. And that's the other thing, if you're looking for a pool and trying to figure out if it's a regulated pool, if there is something like a spotted turtle, like you see here on your screen, or a ringed bog haunter, which you'll see on your screen there too. The presence of those super rare species can also make a vernal pool a regulated vernal pool. I won't go into regulations tonight, and I'm happy to answer questions, but I just wanted to point that out, that the presence of these rare species is also a pretty important indicator of the value of that pool. Things like ribbon snakes will use them. And over 500 different species of invertebrates in the Northeast are found in vernal pools. So things like caddisflies and fingernail clams and phantom midges. There's a whole diversity of invertebrates that are found only in vernal pools and nowhere else. And this isn't one that we often think about, but this is a really important one, a very charismatic species in Maine, the moose. What you'll see, and it's very interesting that in the springtime, vernal pools are often the first places to green up in the forest. And you will, if you're in an area that has a dense moose population, you can often follow a moose trail from vernal pool to vernal pool in the forest as it goes and forages that first, green leaf vegetation that it can eat. This is a picture from a trail cam where we were monitoring a couple vernal pools along a road in Western Maine. And, we kept getting visits time and time again by many different moose that were moving through the area that would stop and feed in these vernal pools. This one you can see is quite dry. It's August when we took this photo, but it's interesting to think about their vernal pools relationship with these bigger animals that are so characteristic of Maine. Vernal pools are also important for avian species too. Things like black ducks will nest in vernal pools. This is a black duck nest in a vernal pool in Brunswick. And so vernal pools are really important for a diversity of animals, both small invertebrates up to large mammals like moose. But it's also the stuff that vernal pools are putting out into the forest. It's the nutrients that are coming from the vernal pool out into the soil and the other animals that are moving around in the landscape. And the way that happens is, one, animals will go to a vernal pool and eat the things that are in them. So raccoons, for example, can clean out an entire vernal pool, eat all the egg masses in a vernal pool in a night. You can have skunks do the same thing. So that's one way, and then they leave and bring those nutrients as they're defecating throughout the forest to other places. That's one way the nutrients move out of the pool and what I think of as fertilize the forest. But the other way it happens is the movement of the animals themselves. So this is a graphic showing a vernal pool and some distances that these animals that are found in vernal pools will move on the landscape. So there's an average distance here and then a maximum distance here. So for example, a spotted salamander, which is shown by this line here, will on average move 390 feet. So let's say 400 feet back and forth from a pool. So it's summertime, fall, winter habitat, it's in the forest, is on average, 400 feet away. And then it's going back to the vernal pool to breed, and then it's going back out into the forest. Something like a wood frog can actually travel a lot farther, 1,500 feet. So we're talking football fields at this point. Big distances for something that small to be traveling on the landscape and not get eaten back and forth annually. So what I like to think of is that, that movement, it's epic. If you think about how small these animals are, National Geographic, Park Service, all these kind of national groups, we always see things, and international groups, we always see coverage of things like the Great Alaskan Caribou Migration, and that is the longest terrestrial migration on the planet. And I'm not discounting that. That is huge. Those animals can move, upwards of 2,700 miles in a year. That's a big movement, but they're also big animals. And so if you look at them ounce for ounce, compared with a wood frog, a caribou weighs 6,000 ounces. A wood frog weighs 0.3 ounces. So they're tiny, they don't weigh very much. If you compare based on their body size, the migration distance they're going in a given year, wood frogs actually have caribou beat. Based on their body size or their body mass, their migration is actually double that of caribou. They are going on an epic migration. It's at a small scale, but for them, it's an epic migration that rivals the caribou. And it's happening here right in our backyards every single year. To me, that is humbling and astounding. What does this result in as they're moving? It results in a ton of stuff going into the forest. Estimates have shown that as a vernal pool produces its animals, produces those tadpoles, produces those larvae that are moving out into the forest, either because they're migrating and dispersing away from it, or because they get eaten and other animals take them out of it, that a single vernal pool can generate something like 1.4 tons of biomass, of stuff, fertilizing that surrounding forest. And if you add up all the amphibian biomass, all the amphibians in the forest in New England, they actually outweigh if you weighed all the birds and vertebrates together. So you took all the amphibians, put them in a pot and weighed them all together. Then you did the same thing with all the moose and the bears and the birds and everything else. You'd actually have more mass in amphibians than you do in the stuff that we usually see in the forest. And that's really important because all of that amphibian mass, biomass, is feeding other stuff, as these slides show, including things like caddisflies. Okay, just a couple quick slides here on climate change, and then we'll come to an end. So one, increasingly important question that I get asked and many people get asked is what's going to happen with climate change? Because here we have a super dynamic system that's tied in with things like snow depth. How much snow you have in the winter is going to influence how much meltwater you have that's filling that pool in the spring. Things like precipitation, temperature, all of that is changing, where we're seeing ice outs on lakes happening 2 weeks earlier, where we're seeing winter come, a week or so later. That's all changing. And so for a system that's so reliant upon precipitation and snowpack, like I said, and things like that, what's going to happen when those things change? So, one thought is that with less snowpack, with flashier precipitation in the summertime, the pattern, the hydro period, is likely going to be less predictable. And it is possible that vernal pools will potentially dry out sooner because they're going to start with less water from snowpack in the spring. Now, with more precipitation, they could quickly fill with a bunch of that spring rainwater, but they're starting out in the beginning with less water filling them than they would if we had more snow in the wintertime. And what can happen with warmer temperatures as well is that they could potentially dry out sooner than the organisms that are in them are adapted to be able to complete their life cycles before that pool dries out. Something that we're studying and following to see how that plays out over time. But the amazing thing about vernal pools, and I said this in the beginning, is that they're all different, like people. And so if we're talking about vernal pools, we don't want to just talk about the pool itself. We want to talk about the pool with the forest around it. But we also want to talk about the pool with the forest around it and the landscape that's around that. Because the way it works, because these amphibians are moving all over the landscape, the way it works is that if you want to conserve vernal pools, you want to think about conserving what's on the landscape. So in this graphic that I have here, imagine this. You've got, and this is in down East Maine, you have a pond. This is a permanent hydroperiod water body. You have a river going here. But on the landscape, you have kind of these shallow pockets of wetland. And then you have these teeny tiny vernal pools with a pretty short hydroperiod. But then you have these bigger vernal pools here and here that have a longer hydroperiod. So by conserving this kind of suite of different stuff on the landscape, even if you have a particularly dry year, even if you don't have much snowpack, and so these two pools don't have a whole lot of water in them, and they don't produce animals in 1 year, you still have these here. You still have these pools here that are going to produce animals in a given year. And those animals will, hopefully, let's imagine the road isn't there. It's a dirt road, so it's not providing much of a barrier. Those animals will eventually make it over to these pools and repopulate them. So you really have to, if you're thinking about climate change and you're thinking about conserving vernal pools, thinking beyond the pool, thinking beyond the forest around the pool, to really thinking about what's on the landscape and how to conserve a diversity of different vernal pool types. So I want to leave you guys with this, exploring vernal pools. Hopefully I've given you some nuggets of information that you'll take with you and want to delve into your own local vernal pools to take a closer look. Bambi talked about the one there right by the gate at the Hidden Valley Nature Center. That's a great pool to take a look at, very easy to get to, great visibility, nothing that, I don't think there are any brambles or anything like that to climb through. It's a fantastic pool to check out. It's a pretty easy, accessible thing to do. So when and where should you go? So right now, this time of year is a perfect time to start looking in vernal pools. This is the guidance my agency provides for when to scout for different things. You can see there on the screen. We're right kind of at the tail end of wood frog season here in southern Maine, but we're right at the hot time for salamanders, finding salamander egg masses. Things to keep in mind: talk to a landowner. If you don't know who owns it, find out. And don't go on a property without asking permission. Those are kind of obvious things to think about. But if you don't have a place in mind, talk to your local land trust. Talk to a local regional biologist who can point you to a wildlife management area. There are pools all over the state, and there are many people who would be happy to help you find one that is easy to get to. Essential gear, boots, that's all you need. Chest waders are great if you're going into a deep pool, but maybe a little bit of overkill. But your basic boots will get you there just fine. You don't need this. We did use this when we were sampling vernal pools because it's pretty cool to snorkel in a deep vernal pool, but this is overkill. Essential gear, you need some glasses, polarized glasses. It helps you. I call them my X-ray vision glasses. Aside from the boots, this is the only other thing you really need. Polarized glasses help you see down through the water better, help you count the egg masses, and in particular, help you see fairy shrimp. It's super hard to see them when there's too much glare on the water. Other things you might want to bring: nets, bags. The bags are helpful for if you catch an amphibian, reducing your handling of that amphibian, particularly if you have, like we all right now, have hand sanitizer on our hands all the time. You don't want to hold it in amphibian if you have hand sanitizer on. They will absorb it right through their skin. So if you do handle an amphibian, putting it into a Ziploc bag temporarily, obviously you don't want to leave it in there all day, but if you're looking at it and holding it up, that's a safer way to handle it than to handle it with direct skin to skin contact. A field guide, we'll talk about kind of some references in a second. These are good too, binoculars so you can see birds and frogs hopping at the other end of the pool, and then a net to catch things, particularly fairy shrimp. That's a great tool for fairy shrimp. Stick to the edge of a pool. Pools can be deep. Like I talked about, my favorite one is over 6 feet deep. So stick to the edge as much as possible, both for safety and so that you don't step on stuff. Blue spotted salamander egg masses are, like I said, tiny and sometimes laid as individual eggs. And they're so hard to see, especially in a dark pool with a lot of like tannins in it. So, if you can stick to the edge and not go into it, that's ideal. And I like to start on the north side. If you're not sure where to start in a big pool and you want to look for stuff, start on the north side, because that's where we tend to see more egg masses laid, because that's the side of the pool that's going to get more of that solar heating in the spring and summertime based on the angle of the sun. And have fun, take your time. That's the other piece, is take your time. If at first you arrive like in a pool like this and you don't see anything, don't give up, find a part of it, slow down, and take a closer look. And chances are you're going to see so much more stuff there than you ever expected. Mosquito larvae, though for kids, looking at mosquito larvae up close is fascinating. So take your time, find a place to start, and take a deeper look. Additional resources, there's many out there. My agency, Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, has a bunch on our website. Maine DEP has more information on regulations and the species and counts that you would need for for a pool to become significant. The University of Maine, this is a fantastic resource. The website is there, and it has PowerPoint presentations and field guides and videos. This was put together by Aram Calhoun and her current students. And I can't say enough about this website. There's so much cool stuff on that. check it out. There's, yeah, just everything you can imagine is on that website. There's a lot more information about that whole blue spotted salamander genetic diversity piece there on the website too. Maine Audubon also has some great information as well. And there's some great books too that are published about vernal pools. This guide here is kind of the classic field guide for vernal pools. There's also a Maine specific amphibians and reptiles book. There's a more kind of science-based conservation of vernal pools. And then this is also a classic Elizabeth Coburn's vernal pool book that talks a lot about invertebrates. So these are all great resources to have. And finally, I would just leave you with this, sort of my own personal bias, I have to say, because I studied vernal pools for a long time and fell in love with them. But as a parent to, you know, youngish kids, I found that they continue to be important, you know, both to me, but also to my kids, and getting them outside and getting them to handle stuff and touch stuff and to be outside and not be afraid to get wet. This is my daughter, sort of, I forget, she's probably 2 years old or 3 years old here on the left. And then last year at a pool recently, and you know, she loves it and continues to want to go in the pool and look. My son, same thing. He was probably my first field assistant, and you know, here he is kind of looking at his first spotted salamander, and he too continues to love and have a great interest in vernal pools. My only caveat with this, of course, is that, you know, ticks are out and abundant and are in the habitats surrounding vernal pools. So do your tick checks and use whatever tick precautions that you normally would do when you're outside. So I say, you know, vernal pools are family friendly for all ages, and then, you know, for all stages as well. This is me, you know, many years ago, sort of starting out my foray into vernal pools, and you know, I still continue to love them and discover new things about them today. So to me, they're an easy ecosystem to really get to know and to spend time with and to return to time and time again. And just the processes and the animals that are in them are fascinating, and they're right here in our backyards. So that's all I have. I'll stop sharing my screen, and it looks like there's some questions in the chat box. There's my contact information there. Feel free to reach out with any questions if you don't get a chance to ask your question tonight, and be happy to help assist you or direct you to someone that can give you any more information. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Amanda. I love it. I have been doing it myself for 10 years, but I'm always learning something new. So, but here's the question I have for you is, how many spermatophores does the female take up? Just one or more than one?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know for sure. I mean, they can have multiple, they can have multiple fathers, I guess, or multiple, yes, so multiple sperm. Sorry, I'm thinking through it as I'm answering.
That's
yes.
okay.
So the offspring can be from more than one father. So yes, they can
Okay.
take up more than one.
Okay. And then how long before she lays her eggs?
Oh, great question. So could be later that night or into the next day. So what's happening is, you know, they're doing that nuptial dance. The males are starting to lay their spermatophores. Sometimes they're laying them anyway. They don't necessarily need that nuptial dance. And the female doesn't even necessarily need the male there for her to take them up. So she will take them up and can start laying them, you know, within a few hours.
Okay. And then would you clarify what the difference is between a wetland and a vernal pool?
That's a great question. And I probably confused everybody. So, you know, wetland has specific characteristics in terms of the soil conditions, in terms of the plants, and in terms of the hydrology. So that's the sort of the technical definition of a wetland. It has to meet certain characteristics in those three bins. Where vernal pools are not technically wetlands is because they often, or many times, don't have the characteristics that would formally make them wetlands. So for example, the soil conditions in the vernal pool, if you dig down into the soil and you look at the soil profile, because a vernal pool may not have water in it for many months out of the year, it may not have those same soil characteristics called hydric soil characteristics that you would see in a classic wetland that has water or saturated soils all the time. So oftentimes a vernal pool soil will not meet that wetland definition. And so because it's not meeting that wetland soil definition, they automatically would get kicked out as being considered a wetland. Does that answer it?
I don't know if she's still on the phone, I mean, on the chat, but good, thank you. Here's one. Are there plants that specifically grow in vernal pools in addition to the evenings?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't think of any that come to mind because a lot of the plants you'll see in vernal pools, you often you will also see in wetlands, and you will also see in uplands. So things like winterberry, very common in vernal pools, but also very common in scrub shrub wetlands. Red maple, common in vernal pools, but you'll often see them, you know, obviously in the forested upland as well. So that's where, again, they get tricky because there's no real, aside from the animals, there's no real obligate stuff that you're only going to see in a vernal pool and not other places.
Right, right. Things that like their feet wet, though.
Things that like their feet wet, yes, or at least can tolerate their feet being wet for part of the year. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's great. I think that's it, Amanda. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to tell the participants that I think that Allie will be sending out the link so you can do this again every day. But better yet,
Share it with other people. Absolutely.
right. And better yet, get out to the vernal pool and do your own exploration. I included a few, well, you'll see it through Amanda's presentation, but in the chat, I included a few links, including a new one that I've just started doing, which is the Big Night Maine. So I'm monitoring road crossing in the, you know, in a big night when it's raining and warm, and hopefully we're finding amphibians crossing the road. So that's something that you can participate in, and there's a link on in the chat. So thanks so much, Amanda.
Thank you,
I'll see you soon.
Amanda. You're
You
awesome.
bet. Thanks for the invitation, everybody. Have a great night and go enjoy some vernal pools.
Great. Thank you.
Take
Thank
care,
you.
everybody.